Thank you. Okay, I think everybody's on the way. Good morning. I was going to say good morning / good afternoon. We're kind of on the cusp there within a minute. A very warm welcome, everybody. We'll just give it a minute or so just to give everybody an opportunity to finish the previous meetings and get onto this one. Lovely to see all your happy faces this morning. You look positively angelic as well, Emma.
Thanks, although the sun coming in is actually quite blinding, so I hate to shut the blind when it's nice, but I might have to.
I know. That's it, isn't it? Lovely. I think we're definitely getting there. I'll just give it another minute or so and then we'll get started just to give everybody an opportunity. If everybody wants to make sure that they've got a cuppa and they feel comfortable, ready to start.
Because I'm a member of CIPD, so usually we'll have some sessions. So there's one we're looking at hybrid working today.
If you're not a speaker and you've got your sound on, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. Okay, lovely, jubbly. Well, I think we've got a good amount of people definitely to get started because we've got a lot of content to cover today. So good afternoon, everybody. It is afternoon now. It's 12:01. A very, very warm welcome to today's Northern Policy Forum session, focused on the reflections of hybrid working, which I think you can agree is still very, very topical. With lots of unfilled vacancies and skills shortages and increased flexibility wanted by the workforce in general, I think you'll all agree that it's been a super, super tough one for HR teams to try and navigate over the last few years. And with most of the British companies taking part in the world's largest trial of the 4-day work week set to continue with the new working pattern, it's a perfect time to come and reflect on how far we've come and where we're at in the north. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kaylee Tobel and I'm an engagement manager on the CIPD Northern England team, and I'll be chairing today's session for you. And just a little bit of background on the forum. CIPD Northern Policy Forum has the main purpose of giving our region's members, HR professionals and customers with a platform to use their voice to help us to influence the government on the future world of work and fulfil our purpose of championing better work and working lives. And your views from the north and your insights help us to respond to work-related government consultations and recommend changes to policy, as well as creating best practice guidance for employers and policymakers. So we do a lot and we're a super active group and we're really, really pleased that you're here. So we'll be running a series of sessions throughout the year. We've got some planned in and we'll be sharing our quarterly forum update to keep you in the loop. I know we've got a lot of new people here today, so if you're not currently a member of the forum and you would like to join, we're going to pop the link in the chat for you and we'll be able to get you signed up from there. So Kim, if you'd be able to pop that in the chat, please, that'll be fantastic. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. As just mentioned, if you could please keep your microphones on mute unless you're asking a question, that would be fantastic. And we've allocated some Q&A time. So if you would like to ask a question, you can either pop it in the chat and the team will pick that up because we are monitoring it throughout the session, or during the Q&A session, if you would like to pop your virtual hand up, we'll try and come to you in best order as possible. With regards to the chat function, please use that to network, share comments, ask questions, and the team will be monitoring that throughout the session. And as on the screen at the minute, we'll be using Menti today just to take a little bit of feed in from you. It'll be fantastic if you've got your mobile phone handy or your iPad and you'd like to take part and feed in. There'll be a couple of questions. There'll be one right now that should be showing in menti.com. All answers provided are anonymous. So, you know, be honest, feel free to share. It'd be lovely if you could. And if you'd be able to take a little look at question 1 now, if you've got scope to, that would be wonderful. We are recording today's session. to share with members externally who couldn't make it. So if you prefer not to be seen, if you could please keep your camera off. And we'd also love to take a photo of you all or a screenshot at some point to put in our communications out to you to showcase the great work that we do. So again, if you don't want to be seen, you'll be able to turn your camera off. So agenda for the day, we're going to come to our colleague Claire first, who's going to provide us with some policy updates and progress. We're then going to come to John, who's going to discuss and walk us through some Northern hybrid working data. Then we're going to come to Stuart from Zenith to talk through what's been happening within Zenith with regards to hybrid working and share with us the journey that he's been on. And then we're going to come to Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to come to Claire McCartney, who is a senior advisor from our CIPD policy team, and she's going to talk us through that first section, which is the policy updates and progress. So over to you, please, Claire.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kaylee, and great to be part of this Northern Policy Roundtable today on hybrid working. I was just taking part in another roundtable around menstrual health and wellbeing just a couple of weeks ago, so it's really great to be part of your groups, and I know that you're really active. So as Kaylee said, I'm Claire. I sit in the public policy team at the CIPD. And I have been leading on quite a bit of our flexible working policy agenda. And it's certainly been a lively area throughout and beyond the pandemic. And I think we've certainly seen some significant changes in the way that organisations are approaching flexible working, hybrid working, different ways of working. So as Kaylee said, I'm just going to give a short overview this afternoon up front of some of our policy work in this area before handing back over to John. If you've got any questions, do post them up in the chat. I know we've got time at the end to get to those and have a good discussion as well. So if I move to my first slide, I just wanted to really flag that we've been building up momentum around our insights on flexible working and new ways of working throughout the pandemic. So if we just move on, you can see a variety of the reports that we've been working on, and there have been lots. And I thought I'd just flag our hybrid working guidance that we led on with the Flexible Working Task Force. And I'll say a little bit more about the Flexible Working Task Force and our role within that. But that's been quite useful guidance around people management practices when it comes to managing hybrid in terms of recruitment, induction, well-being, and equality and inclusion, which I think is really important. I thought I'd also flag the 4-day week report that John led on because we have seen so much news in the media around the outcome of the trials, and I know John's been doing lots of great media work on this as well, so really topical. So if we move on to the next slide, I thought it'd be helpful just to share what we've been doing in terms of some of our campaign work. So we have led a really quite comprehensive campaign around Flex from First. So I hope some of you are aware of this and have been engaging with us. And that was really around calling for the right to request flexible working to become a day one right rather than after 26 weeks as it is at the moment. And we were calling on the government to make this change, but we were also calling on employers to start making this change. And this really stemmed from research that we conducted at the CIPD, where we felt that flexible working practices weren't necessarily fair, with nearly half of British employees saying that they didn't have access to flexible arrangements as part of their current role. And of course, while we've seen lots of developments in terms of hybrid throughout and beyond the pandemic, which really focuses on location, I think there's been less focus on flexible working for the quite high proportion of people that need to go into the physical workspace and those in frontline roles. So we hope that this will put a spotlight and broaden out opportunities for everyone. So if we move on again, we were therefore really delighted when the government announced in December, so if we just move on to the next slide, that millions of workers will be able to request flexible working from day one of employment. And obviously we responded to the government's consultation on this, and I'm sure we held lots of regional roundtables, so I'm sure many of you will have fed into those roundtables, and if you did, thank you very much for doing that. and we held a big survey. So we put in a comprehensive response to the consultation supporting the right to request flexible working as a day one right. What's happening is that's going to go through secondary legislation, and then Yasmin Qureshi has a private members bill which is also making further changes to the right to request flexible working, including the requirement of employers to consult with their employees as a means of exploring the available options before rejecting a flexible working request, also allowing employees to make 2 flexible working requests in any 12-month period. At the moment, it's just 1 request in that period, and also a requirement of employers to respond to requests within 2 months, which is previously was 3 months. So some quite big changes going around the right to request. Obviously, this isn't necessarily going to be a panacea in itself, but we hope it will signal the intention to do more around flexible working. And obviously, we're very much here to support organisations around, making that change to their policies, and they don't necessarily need to wait for that legislation to come in to start making change in this area. So moving on again, I just wanted to flag our involvement in the Flexible Working Task Force, which some of you may have heard about from a policy perspective. So Peter Cheese, our Chief Executive, co-chairs the task force, and it's quite a wide-ranging group, different membership from government departments, BEIS, the Treasury, DWP, also professional bodies like ourselves, charities, all coming together to try to improve awareness and access to flexible working. So of late, we've been focused on good practices and putting out guidance to support hybrid working practices. But the group will also be doing more to support around the legislation change as well, and hopefully put some practical guidance out around that. And I think there's also a desire to explore informal flexibility within cultures and how we can promote that as well, recognising that that is really beneficial. So I think it's likely in the future there'll be another consultation around informal flexibility or a call for evidence. So again, we will be looking to call upon our members to feed into that and to really inform that. Okay, so moving on again to the next slide, I thought I'd also flag that we're part of a new commission on hybrid and remote working. And this commission is going to examine and make recommendations on how the government can respond to the rise in hybrid and remote working to the advantage really of everyone. So some of the questions that the commission are going to look at is how can remote and hybrid work support growth in towns and cities across the UK? How can it create more inclusive and accessible workplaces for all groups? I think that's a really key question. How can remote and hybrid have, what impact can it have on workplace rights and culture, and also on wider communities and families? So we will keep you informed as to the kind of the progress and recommendations coming out from that new commission. So I thought I'd just finish off with my final slide by just looking at some of the media and policy impact that we've had in this area. So obviously we're delighted to have success with the Flex From First campaign. We've also fed into quite a few different all-party parliamentary groups. I've got one here, the Business in a Pandemic, APPG, where we've talked about our flexible working and hybrid findings. We've had lots of high-profile media opportunities, which again helps to support our engagement with policymakers. And we've also featured in a number of reports, such as the Women and Equality Select Committee report and the Women and Work All-Party Parliamentary Group report as well. And yeah, lots of coverage of the 4-day week report, courtesy of John, who is coming next. So that's a really good segue, I think. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of where we are in terms of our policy work and impact. And I'm going to hand you over now to John, who I know is going to do some whizzy things with data and take a look at some of the trends in your region when it comes to hybrid and flexible working. So over to you, John.
Thank you. So I'm going to attempt to take control of the presentation, control my slides, and when that doesn't work, at that point we'll go back to the other way of doing it. So I'm going to choose this screen, and hopefully everyone can see this presentation. And if I press the presentation button, and maybe I can. Right, does that look good? Good.
We're looking good, John.
Perfect. So. I think I've just undone it because I didn't know how to do the next. Okay, we're nearly there, I promise. Right, so aha, here we go. First slide. So I wanted to give you some background on my sort of adventures in home working. And pre-pandemic, this is a report I wrote. It's what's driving the rise in remote working. So that says April 2020. I'd actually left work at CIPD in February. So I wrote this pre-pandemic because I'm a boomerang employee. I came back, and I'd noticed that home working had gone from 3% of workers to 5% in 20 years. And I thought that's massive. 3 to 5%, that's a 40% increase. So I wrote this report because I thought this is such a big trend. This is going to be huge. And then I updated this chart here recently, and this is what happened. So the dotted line is where the chart ran out, and it obviously it all sort of went through the roof. And what the interesting thing about this chart is that we can split that by a bunch of other things and really get under the skin of who works home and hybrid. Now, the question asked here is, where is your main place of work? And the answer is home. So, and every time someone said home, that's where I charted it. So what this does is this kind of understates hybrid working, because hybrid workers might work from home, say 2 days a week, and in the office 3 days, and they would answer somewhere away from home, and they wouldn't be in this chart. But these two things move together. So what I'm going to do is going to cut it by a few aspects, the first being broad occupational groups, and then we'll get towards the geography and look more at some of the things happening in the north. But these charts really set the scene. They will probably tell you more about your own specific organization and the challenges you have. So the chart shows that for managerial, professional, associate professional, and administrative secretarial occupations, these guys are through the roof. They're over 30% working exclusively from home. I estimate that this is about half of what is hybrid. So if something says 30, then I'd say 60% of that group are hybrid, because that's how these numbers tend to move together. And essentially what it tells you is if your work is kind of knowledge work or office based, it can be done from home. You have very high levels of home working. The next chart I've looked by, well, James actually did this week. He looks by qualification level. And I don't think it tells us much new information actually, but it tells you that the higher qualification level you have, the higher levels of home working you have. So people with the degrees at the top, other sort of higher education below degree, followed by sort of A levels, then GCSEs, right down to no qualification at the bottom. So that's a bit of a concern, I suppose, when we think about inequality and the idea of a two-tiered workforce. But ultimately, all groups are up. So there's a kind of net advantage to all groups, but some groups are, doing better than others. The next chart I think is genuinely fascinating, and that is a chart showing working from home by age. The reason I think it's very interesting is pre-pandemic, the oldest age group, so this is 65 to 70, 60 to 65, sort of they were the top home workers. Post-pandemic, it's these middle age groups from about 35 to 55 that have kind of shot through the top, or maybe 35 to 55, and they're at the top. So something's going on here. I have a theory, which is that when you're middle age, that's when the commutes are the longest. That's when you're most likely to be a line manager. So I think that's when work's most intense. You probably have childcare responsibilities and aging parents. So I think working from home is taking the edge off for this kind of middle-aged cohort of people, which is very interesting. And now I'm getting more to the regional stuff. So this is the Northern Policy Forum. So we want to see what's happening locally in your region. The big sort of story, I suppose, is that London and the Southeast are, the clear winners. In the middle, we've got Northeast, which is, lagging. lagging towards the bottom. We got the northwest, which is at pretty mid-range. Actually, the pink line's hiding a bit here, but it's kind of in the middle. And I suppose we've got Yorkshire and Humberside, which is kind of down there with the northeast. It's kind of one of the lower areas. Northern Ireland's a real outlier. What you might notice about this chart, though, is it's pretty frazzled at the end. And I think that's kind of like a little bit of an overshoot and then calling people back into work. But we're still way above pre-pandemic levels. I mean, this is a new territory, and I'm not even particularly sure where it's gonna sort of finish, where it's going to end up. Finally, we're going to just look at this very detailed geography. So this local authority, and this is another map that James has made pre-pandemic and the most recent data. What's really interesting about this is James had to use the pandemic year, because pre-pandemic there was so little data, there were so few people homeworking that the whole chart was just kind of missing data and there was nothing to actually chart. But what I find fascinating about this chart is that you can actually see, I mean, you can see the M4 and the M3 and the kind of London commuter belt, but also around the big conurbations in the north, that's where you're getting more, I guess you're getting more tradable work. So work that you are making a product or service that you're selling outside of the region. Now, James has actually made this as a kind of interactive chart, and he'll post the link in the chat, I think, and it's in the slides anyway. And this will let you explore your area. So I'd actually requested this data because someone at the Financial Times wanted to write a story, and then they never did. So then I sort of gave it to James, and he worked out how to put it in a chart. So if you want to look a bit more specifically at your area, there's a kind of key here. But if you press somewhere, so if we go to Liverpool, it's 21.2%. We're mainly working from home in Liverpool in the period, the latest available data that we had. And obviously you can sort of keep going to other areas that work for you. So hopefully that's fun. Hopefully that was a kind of whistle-stop tour of the big trends that I think are driving home and hybrid working. I've included in the slides some of James and my details, because we post these charts all day long. And yeah, I will probably hand back now, because I think that's pretty much.
John, would you be able to just quickly show us that, please? And would it be possible to do a little quick interactive whiz around?
Oh yeah,
on
sure.
that? Yeah, I've just got a couple of people in the chat just wanting, I think, the links to it, which would be great. But it would also be good if we could have a little whiz around, if you could just show us what it looks like and what information we can get from that.
Sure. I mean, it's pretty simple. So for any one area, you can click and it will say the percentage of people who were mainly working from home. So in Eden, it's 12%. I think it's nice that you can kind of see it's a heat map. So when it's kind of bluer, that means there's lower rates of home working, and the sort of hotter it gets, there's higher rates. It might be a bit limited by my geography here. If someone asks me, I'm not necessarily going to be able to pick it out, but there's York, for example, 25.7%. And obviously like 25.7%, that's like a really high rates of home working. Essentially, it kind of shows, you can see it, it's all the major conurbations where it really happens. And like I say, it's the difference between local services and tradables. So if you're sort of cutting someone's hair, the thing that you're producing, the consumption of that thing and the production happen in the same place. You can't really split them. Whereas if you do sort of work like I do, write reports, then it's quite easily to do it. I mean, this is a prime example. I'm literally presenting my work to you, but from a very distant place. So yeah, is there any particular area you want me to pick on?
I just wondered whether the map that you've just been discussing there, John, kind of reveals any information or any kind of standout information about the north, or kind of areas within the northern region.
I mean, I think what it mainly shows is where the big conurbations are. So if we kind of go around here, of course, Liverpool, and then this is obviously Manchester, and that's why it's hotter, because there's more of this kind of tradable services that happen in cities. So yeah, Trafford 28%, Stockport 24%, and yeah, Manchester 24%. These are really high rates of home working in the cities. So I can almost pretty much just look, see a hot colour, and know that there'll be a city there. So Sheffield there, even if not knowing geography, you know, I can click and it's York. Obviously there's a city that's kind of the big driver, and it's the same pattern that you see down here. It's more marked, I think, in the southeast, probably just because there's a kind of denser population of people around here, so there's more data and more going on. But yeah, essentially you're just showing the major conurbations. If I click up here, Allerdale, not really sure quite what's happening there. Probably if there's one city or a big town within a large unit of geography, it'll make a big difference. But you know, this is data that I've not really seen used very much anywhere else, but it's absolute gold because there's a time series going to pre-pandemic, so we can sort of chart it over time. And when we use this data, which comes from the annual population survey, it's got a big enough sample that we can break it down by these local geographies, which I think is really useful. I think that even though the map is kind of really good fun, it's the underlying drivers of home working, which is essentially the jobs that people do. So the occupation chart that I showed, that's probably more interesting to people specific organizations. You know, if you are a firm in Liverpool or, you know, another area with high rates of home working, you're probably going to share more in common with a similar firm anywhere else in the country than a firm that's just nearby. So firm in the same industry with the same sort of mix of jobs. So that's why there's limits to what you can do with the geography. But no, we were quite impressed that we were able to produce this map, that we were able to come up with enough data to show it. So yeah, like I say, it might be a bit more interesting for people to have a click and then explore themselves. They might be able to see some of the motorways and networks a bit better. I mean, obviously, I can sort of intuitively see the M4 and the M3, but my geography is just not as great when we get slightly further north.
No worries. Well, thank you for walking through that, John. And I know that we've popped, or James has popped the link to that in the chat, so you can go in, you can have a little click on and explore for your area. I just wanted to highlight, just before we do come to Stuart, Emma's popped a note in the chat. That would be great if she could hear about any data or best practice examples of maintaining culture and connection for a hybrid workforce. This is a major challenge. Also about how hybrid and remote working is pulling talent from local areas to major cities, and perhaps even from the north down to London. So really, really great point there, Emma. And please do reach out to Emma if you've got anything that you could share there, because that's really, really interesting. And I know we've got a little bit going on the chat there as well about, you know, the manufacturing based workforce as well, and what they can do to support flexible working, because I know it's still obviously a little bit more difficult. So there's a bit going on there. So thank you for continuing on in the chat. But without further ado, let's come to Stuart. A very, very warm welcome to Stuart Price from Zenith, and over to you.
Thanks, Kaylee. Hi, everybody. Great to be talking to you. I thought I'd start off very quickly, just telling you 1 minute about what we do and who we are, just so you can get the context for our organisation. So Zenith, if you don't know us, is the UK's leading independent leasing and fleet management outsourcing business. We run company cars, company fleets for commercial vehicles, and also do direct consumer leasing offer as well. So I'm not going to plug the business, but there is one thing just to kind of talk about some context for this subject. So we are headquartered in Leeds. So our main office is based in Leeds. We have 2 other offices, satellite offices around the UK in the Midlands and the Northwest. But we also have an hourly paid operational workforce based out of 4 workshops and a community of mobile service technicians. And given that this is about hybrid working, some of our colleagues, for example, the people that work in our workshops, can't repair trucks and trailers for our customers at home. So this kind of policy applies to our office-based people, but it's a really good point, and it's come up a couple of times about how do you provide other flexible working to that workforce. So maybe we'll get the opportunity to cover that in the Q&A. So what I thought I'd do is just take you on the journey that we went on. How did we put Agile into the business? You know, what was the case for change? What were some of the considerations? Where did we land on our policy? And some of the lessons, learned. And then clearly in the Q&A, hopefully we can go to any of the areas that might be specifically of interest to you. So like most of you, the change came from COVID. It was the best catalyst and business case that we could have asked for, in all honesty. Prior to COVID, about 11% of Zenith colleagues were enabled to work from home. So 89% of our business were coming into an office, working predominantly Monday to Friday, predominantly 9 till 5. And then as part of COVID, like so many other businesses, we transitioned 98.5% of our workforce to home working. And we did that for pretty much 18 months, even in the gaps when we unlocked and we were able to come back in the office, we gave people the choice. And so the vast majority of our workforce worked from home for 18 months. And I joined the business on the 4th of January, which was the day of lockdown 3. So went into the office on my first day and then went home that evening. Was told by Boris that I couldn't go back to the office for 3 more months whilst we remained locked down. So my first project as CPO was to design what the future of the working practice looked like. So we did a big survey of all colleagues to say to them, you know, what did they want it to look like? And very similar to John's findings that you've heard, the results were pretty staggering. So 44% of colleagues wanted to continue working from home 3 to 4 days a week. 30% of colleagues wanted occasional home working. 23% of colleagues wanted to continue to work from home full time. Now, we don't think that will be as high now, but that was what it was at the time. And wait for it, only 3% of the workforce didn't want to work from home at all. So, you know, there was a really stark message from our people, which was we don't want to go back to 89% of people having to come into the office. Clearly, there was some novelty factor. You know, we'd all been enjoying this different way of life for 18 months. And so we needed to come up with a solution that was right, you know, for the long term. Ordinarily, you'd want to be guided by research and evidence, and at the time there wasn't a huge amount around that explained what the long-term implications of permanent home working were. But instinctively, we knew that there were some pros to home working and there were some definite cons. And we just knew that from talking to colleagues and experiencing how they were feeling. So I don't need to cover all the pros. You guys will know those, but certainly the cons that we identified were around, you know, relationships for colleagues, certainly people who were joining the business. So if you'd been in the company for 10 years and had loads of relationships established, then it was okay. But certainly for me joining, I found it a lot harder to build those meaningful relationships with people. And so, you know, that was a key con. As human beings, we're innately social creatures. And so, you know, the need to be sociable and to be around people and bounce off people was also a massive con. And one of the things that we noticed was that, you know, problem solving did take longer. It was harder to do, and people didn't seem to feel that they were as innovative and creative in a screen setting as they were when they were in a room with colleagues. This is what people were telling us. And then certainly learning and career development felt harder to do in a hybrid space. And it was interestingly, whilst young people love working flexibly and remotely at times, they were the strongest voice that said to us, we're missing out on learning opportunities that previous generations had. And so, you know, whether it was somebody that had just taken on a new role or it was a young person that had never been in work before, and we have a really high contingent of apprenticeships, and we'd taken on quite a few Kickstarters and various other bits, and those colleagues really missed that office environment. So we knew there were pros, we knew there were cons. And so we kicked off a cross-functional project team with a number of work streams, which again, we haven't got the time to go into, but I can answer any questions in the Q&A. But it was covered by operators as well as central policy folk from people, facilities, the operational teams. And the whole purpose was to collectively design what our future working practice was going to be. So we came up with the agile concept, which is what we call it at Zenith. And I'm just going to cover for you what the key principles were that we landed on. So the first thing was that we would operate a hybrid approach. And the reason for that was because we didn't want to be an all office business. We didn't want to be an all home business for all the reasons I've just said around the pros and cons. And we wanted to get the best of both. So hybrid was the way. It doesn't mean we don't have some permanent home workers, but we choose those roles really, really carefully for all the reasons I've mentioned earlier. The second principle was around trust. So we had trusted our colleagues to work independently, remotely, at home for 18 months. And in that 18-month period, our business grew, our profitability grew, and the business performed really, really, really successfully. So we had no reason not to trust our people to do the right thing. And this is really, really important. And I'll come back to it in a moment. So the concept that was born out of trust was that you can choose when, where, and how you work. But there are three priorities that you have to consider. The first one is, does it service the customer? The second one is, does it service my team? And the third one is, does it service me? And when making your decisions about where, when, and how you do your work, and we trust you to do that, you have to consider those three things. And it's obviously like a Venn diagram. They overlap, and sometimes the needs of the individual are greater than the customer and the team. Sometimes the needs of the customer is greater than the individual. And I'm going to come on to some scenarios that we did within our training that really helped people to make the right decisions. The fourth area was around enablement. So how do we enable people to work in a hybrid way? So we invested about £500,000 in our office premises to put the right kit and technology in. So it's so frustrating when you're dialing in externally, there's a group of people in the office and you feel like you can't contribute to that meeting because the microphones are rubbish or I can't see who's in the room. So in order to make this work, we knew that we needed a better tech solution than we'd had through COVID. So we invested in that equipment to make sure that the camera pans onto the individual when they're talking. There's microphones across the room so that the sound quality is really good. Because what we noticed was that if everyone was remote, the meeting was effective. If everyone was in the office, the meeting was effective. But when you've got this hybrid, it was less effective. So technology played a huge part in our approach. And then the final one, the principle was one size doesn't fit all. And so the amount of requests that I had from business areas that were, so how many days does that mean that I can ask people to come in the office? Or how many days does that mean I can let people work from home? Or what can I do to get people to come into the office? So we were really clear that we won't prescribe this within our policy and that it would be a principles-led approach to how we apply it. So for example, and we talked about this a lot with colleagues and leaders, if you've got a week that's full of customer meetings and they all want to see you in the office, well, guess what? You're going to need to be in the office. If you haven't got any meetings that require you to be in the office, well, you can work from home the whole week. That's absolutely fine. And equally, if you have got a new colleague in your team, or you've got quite a young demographic within your team who need a bit more leadership, a bit more support, then you will need to be in the office a bit more than someone whose team is a bit more established, a bit more mature, a bit more experienced. And so we have to remember that our customer needs and our colleague needs are often unique. And you can't prescribe a policy that means that everybody's the same, because it doesn't work. And therefore, this is about flexibility both ways. It's not about the colleague having all the flexibility, the business getting none, or vice versa. This is about, true agility and making a decision for each day of your working week about what the needs of your customer team and you are. So how did we implement it? Some of the key things I thought I'd share. First was manager training. So you cannot do this through a policy alone. You have to support your leaders to implement this. And where we had really good levels of engagement in the training from leaders, we had great implementation of Agile. And where we didn't, guess what? We ran into problems. And the training was not all about the policy. We talked about the principles, and the vast majority of the training was about scenarios that leaders will face and how to deal with those. So it was really practical. For example, I've got a colleague that wants to work from home, but I think that they need to be in because the customer needs it or the team needs it. How do I deal with that? And how do I have a conversation with people around that? So leadership training on the principles, the theory of why we landed on Agile, and how to actually implement it. Real practical, operational guidance. The other thing we did was communication. We massively communicated this. And because people had been used to working from home for 18 months, we knew that we'd need to swing it back into the centre. And so we communicated, again, with lots of scenarios and examples. I did some video messages, which also include scenarios to help colleagues to understand it. And then in terms of our policy, we went really light touch. So it was a couple of pages of principles that gave flexibility to both the colleague and the business to respond to any challenges that we faced along the way. So what did we see? We saw actually initially quite a lot of home working, and it was a test of our resilience, I think I would say, because a lot of business leaders, we need to be putting people back in, and it was like, no, just hold it, just wait, it will happen. And exactly that did happen. So we've seen the pendulum now swing right back into the centre, and I feel like we've really got the balance of both. We're not too remote, we're not too office centric, and people generally are making the right calls. The other thing that we are seeing, and I think John's data evidences this is the single most valued benefit within Zenith. So if you ask colleagues, what's the best thing about working here in terms of benefits and flex, they will talk about Agile, and it's so important to people. And I can give you one snippet as an example. Whenever I used to do interviews before COVID, it would be interview 2 or interview 3 before someone would start asking me about my flexible working policies or how they can work. Now it's interview 1, guaranteed every single time. So, not only do colleagues really value this, they also kind of expect it. And then talking a bit about the results that we've had from it, I've got loads, but the 2 that always stand out to me, 2%, our labour turnover is 2% lower now than it was pre-pandemic. And if you think, since Unlock, we have had the hardest and toughest labour market that we've experienced for years. So to reduce our turnover by 2% against that backdrop, we attribute a huge amount of that towards our Agile working. And the second one, which I'm super, super proud of, 75% of the promotions that we've had since implementing Agile have gone to women. And that shows in an automotive sector, which was predominantly led by men pre-COVID, this has opened up opportunities to a much greater group of talent. And we have got some phenomenal leaders, female leaders now running really significant operations within our business, because we've enabled them to have a family and to be able to, to do the work. So they were some of the highlights of implementation. Very quickly, because I'm running out of time, lessons learned: train leaders in scenarios, don't train them in policy. Go back round again on leadership training. So we have had a couple of scenarios where operational issues have materialised, and the answer is get them all back in the office. So we've had to go back round and do some re-education. Don't underestimate how much support your leaders will need to implement this really well. When there are operational challenges, it's really easy to blame it on Agile rather than really getting to the root cause of, you know, what is causing those problems. So be the voice of evidence and data and say, well, you know, it worked in COVID for 18 months, so why is it now all of a sudden a problem? So, you know, get the evidence to really understand what those operational issues are, and don't let your flexible working be the casualty of those operational issues, because very often it isn't the reason for it. Don't over-engineer your policies. You know, there's a real danger to make them really long and convoluted and try and be overly prescriptive. I personally like to start from the position of trust, and trust that people will, you know, make the right decisions, and manage the exception. Don't make your policies go right down to the lowest common denominator in your business. Otherwise they become really unengaging. And then finally, give people a reason to come into your office. So we did a massive inclusion month last year where we had loads of external speakers, and we saw the office environment boom. Loads of people were in. We couldn't get into the car park. It was like pre-COVID all over again. But people actually said, oh, I've loved coming in and seeing people and those, you know, conversation. But if we hadn't given them a reason, they might not have done it as much. So think about your office as a place for collaboration, excitement, and give them a reason to come in. Sorry if I've overrun by a couple of minutes. Kaylee, I will hand back to you. I'm very happy to take any questions on our journey.
Thank you, Stuart, and I'm pleased you overran a little bit because I think all of those really key points at the end were fantastic. And if I'd be able to, can I come to you and gather those points, Stuart, in writing so we can send out to everybody afterwards?
Oh yeah, no problem.
Fantastic, lovely. Really, really interesting. And I think, you know, the where, when and how is really short, succinct, and does the job by the sounds of things, and allows that level of flexibility. And I really also like the point that you made about the tech solutions, and making sure that that's all fit for purpose and works and is really super inclusive, because I think there's a lot of opportunity that can come from digital culture, in how we go about that and how we support that and foster that really positive culture. And I'm so pleased as well that you mentioned about the one size doesn't fit all. You know, not everybody fits into that specific bracket in mandating particular amounts of days and things. So, you know, really, really useful, and thank you for sharing with us. And of course, I'm really super chuffed as well about, you know, the increase in female leaders that you've seen as well. Yeah, I'm sure that's a really great personal win. I can see a few hands going up in the air there as well. So thank you so much for sharing all that, Stuart. So what I'd like to do is now, just for a moment, just while I give everybody a chance to digest and reflect on that information from Stuart, John and Claire, I'd just like to share with you the poll from menti.com. So thank you for everybody who's taken part in that and who has submitted an answer. So that first question was, what does the hybrid working policy look like in the organisations that we have with us today in the meeting? And I think the overwhelming kind of outcome of that is we do already have a policy in place, but it needs tweaking. And then shortly followed by, we do have a policy and it's working quite well. Followed by, we don't have one, or we have one that needs a lot of work. So hopefully those people today will have been able to take away some pointers, or at least some takeaways to make sure that you can do those tweaks.
Kelly, can I just make one point on this?
You can.
And I probably should have done it before this call, so forgive me. But it's really interesting that we talk about, every question is about, we have a policy. And if you go back to some of my kind of lessons around this, so whenever there's been a problem with Agile, the business response is, we need to change the policy, we need to tweak the policy. Actually, there's nothing wrong with our Agile policy. It's got tons of flexibility in it for the business. We could absolutely make a case to bring people into the building if we needed to. It's about the execution of it. So my only shift here is, everyone goes to policy when there's a problem, but actually it's often leadership and the execution of the policy that's the issue. So when people say to me, our agile policy needs tweaking, my response is, I'm not sure it does. Tell me why. I think it's a leadership training issue, or it's a leadership execution issue. So it's just a slight different way of looking at it.
Great, and I think you're right there, Stuart, and need to do a little bit of digging if you do get that feedback, and really get to the root cause of why it's not working, if that's the case, because it's quite subjective. Yeah, so thank you, excellent point. So I'll pause on that for a minute. Just really wanted to share with you kind of where we're at today with everybody that we've got in the call, and there will be another question soon. But I'd like to open up our Q&A session, please. And I know that we've got a couple of questions already in the chat, so I'll probably kick off with one. I like to kick off with the question. I'm just getting my mouse to come over here. We've got a question in the chat. A question for you, Stuart. How are you engaging with the teams that can't work remotely at all? Those mechanics, those people that you mentioned at the beginning, can they have some flex on working hours or other benefits that kind of sweeten the deal for them?
Yeah, so we are working on that, and we do it. And I think it's a really important consideration for businesses that have different workforces. When you've got sort of people in service industries that have to be in a physical premise in order to do their job. So what are we trying to do for that group? Well, you can fix the truck at a different time of the day. So for example, we are allowing people to come in earlier, finish earlier, and those types of flexible working arrangements. We have all the typical stuff you'd expect, things like shift swaps and the ability to move hours around the working day. The challenge is they have to do it either where the customer is, if they're a mobile technician, or on the site, if they work in the workshop. So the location is the bit that they don't have the flexibility for. But in terms of when and how, we do try to really empower those techs to be able to do that around the customer needs.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Stuart. And I think, offering as much flexibility around those other elements that you do have control of, hopefully will help that.
Hayley, is it all right just to come in on that as well? Because
of course,
we've done quite a bit of research at the CIPD around cross-sector insights, particularly around kind of more difficult sectors like manufacturing, construction. I saw in the chat that was certainly something that was raised around what type of flexibility you can afford. And I think, it's not necessary to treat everyone the same as what Stuart was just saying, but to have some kind of parity across workers. And so I think even sometimes just a little tweak for people, which means that they feel like they've got better control over their work-life balance, their own personal lives, can be really helpful. So for instance, I know one of the organisations that we looked at, Skanska, have a Flexit grid that their managers use with employees, and that looks specifically at their role and what type of flexibility might be able to afford to them. And also within the same organisation, they look at kind of team-based rostering around flexible working, so getting the team together to work out what can be accommodated and what can't. So it's not rocket science, but actually it makes a real difference to the employees in that sector. And then the other thing I thought I'd just flag is also time-wise, I've got some really good research and evidence around looking at flexibility in frontline roles. So they've looked at kind of retail, construction, NHS, caring sectors, and they've looked at some of the types of things that can make a big difference. And often actually when people are working to shifts or rotas, it's about actually having some kind of predictability around those that can make a real difference, some advance notice around things as well. So there's just little things that can make quite a big difference. So I thought I'd just flag those as well.
Thank you, Claire. And again, what I'll do is I'll collect all of these resources. I'll include them within the post-event comms to make sure that you can go away and you can have another look at those at your own leisure, depending on what you would like a bit of support with. So thank you for coming in on that, Claire. Would anybody like to ask a question in person? I don't see any hands up at the minute, but just giving you a little opportunity because we do have some more questions in the chat. But if you would like to pop your hand up and ask one in person, that's absolutely fine as well. Trish, I can see your hand up. Would you like to go ahead, please?
Hi, Kaylee. Thank you.
Okay.
So it was just really around with the rising cost of living. We've got individuals wanting to work from home, but so we're construction, so people often ask for money a lot of the time. So have you had sort of situations, because this is the only thing that sort of worries me, as that sort of creeping up. I think this will be the next thing in terms of potentially insurance costs. We're being asked for sort of duplicate equipment, the cost of heating, electricity. Obviously, as an employer, we're already paying those overhead costs in the office. So if people choose not to come in, we can't reduce those costs. So you're effectively duplicating. What sort of advice do you have? Have you come across that?
I mean, I'm happy to go on this one. I mean, I'll be really honest. I just said no. So the in order to provide a safe working environment for people, absolutely. So the things like desks and proper chairs, and making sure particularly young people who might be living in smaller rooms or whatever, have the right safe working environment. That's absolutely our responsibility. But in terms of paying for people's heating, this is a choice, and we have an office because we value the collaboration, the space, and all of the things that I went through earlier, and we have the overheads and the costs of running that. Interestingly, what we've seen during the winter is more people in the office because of the rising costs of fuel, and so it's actually become a bit of a haven for some people to support them. But I'm very much expecting that to shift a little bit back in the summer months. But that's agile, that's one of the principles is what's right for me. And if it's better for somebody to be in the office because it's warm and that's better for them and they don't want to heat their own house, then that's fine. And if in the summer they don't need that need, but they can still meet the customer and team needs, well, that's okay too. So I've kind of held the position, which is no, and this is a great benefit and we're really proud of it, and it doesn't include all of your home expenses outside of the things that keep you safe.
Great, thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Stuart. And thank you, Trish, for your question. Emma, I can see your hand up. We'll come to you next, please.
Thanks, Kaylee. I was just going to ask, this might not be an issue at Zenith, given what you've said about the talent management and seeing more female leaders coming through, but there is the potential for proximity bias and for opportunities, new projects and promotions going to people who are more on site and therefore more visible. So potentially disadvantaged groups such as colleagues of colour or colleagues with disabilities perhaps might miss out on those opportunities. I just didn't know if there was any particular stance on that, or if you're trying to make actions to prevent that becoming an issue.
It's a great question, and it is a consideration. We've noticed it's been less about proximity bias and more about the individual line manager's bias and preference. So because this is open to everybody at every level of our organisation, if you've got a line manager that's really pro-agile and enjoys home working, then we haven't seen that bias, because they are supporting people who equally want to work in that way. And I think that's why we've seen a positive impact on our diversity and inclusion agenda. But where you have the occasional manager who has a preference for working in the office, then I think you do still see some of that, and that's why we've gone back round with all of our training. So I would say it's less about proximity and more about each individual's preferences. So it'd be really interesting, and I would predict this is the case, that if a manager is somebody that much prefers to be in the office, say 4 days a week, and that's their right, okay, so that's not a criticism, that's what works for me, and it's okay, but I suspect they would probably lean closer towards people that come in more, and vice versa. So that's the bit that you've got to watch, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stuart. Great question, Emma, there.
Should I just...
We're definitely
sorry.
testing Stuart today. Sorry, Claire, we've only got 2 minutes left and I'm very conscious to run over. I think we could have gone on for a while, unless you're super duper quick.
No, I'm just going to say we've got lots of tips around inclusion. I think it's a really valid question, Emma, and you know, we need to put ED&I at the heart of our hybrid policies and really make sure we're assessing those so those biases aren't creeping in. But I think Stuart covered it brilliantly, so I shall hand back to you, Kaylee.
Thank you. And again, we can include those, Claire. I'll come out to you and we'll get all those resources sent out to everybody. So the final questions there on Menti, it would just be really great to see what your key takeaways are from today's session. And a huge thanks to our speakers today, to Claire, John and Stuart. You've done absolutely fantastic for us today. Super duper information, really interesting questions and discussion as well. So as mentioned, we will be sending all of the resources and materials out from today, including the slides, so you can continue that discussion within your organisations. And if you do have any questions following the session, or you would like to reach out to us, you can contact us at cipdnorth@cipd.co.uk. And our next session is going to be focused on addressing recruitment shortages through inclusive hiring. So I guess that's kind of linked to the last question. And it's live on Eventbrite now. So if you're not already registered, it would be great to see you all there. And I think my colleague can pop up at the chat if possible, please, Kim. And I'd just like to really thank everybody for coming along today and hope that you have a great end of week. Like I say, it would be great to see what your key takeaways are from today's session, and I can share that as well with you in the post-event materials. Thank you very much, and I will leave it there. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.